Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the STP training webinar series, the topic of which is Keys to Effective Test Automation in DevOps. Our speaker for the day is Lee Barnes. I'm Smita Mishra, a professional tester myself, and I'm excited to host you all and Lee on our STP webinars. Quick information for all of you. The next upcoming conference we have is Fall 2019 STP Con, which will be held at Boston from 23rd of September to 26th. It's the 10th year anniversary of STP Con, and yes, we have supported testers for 10 solid years and built a thriving community of theirs in our own way, and we would like for all of you to join us at the event. The keynotes have been selected and announced. You can look them up at stpcon.com. We have the world-famous automation leader Angie Jones, the automation and testing leader Dorothy Graham, a world-renowned speaker, and a bright technopreneur, Kevin Suresh. And finally, we have the hugely popular testing leader, a mentor to many, our very own Mike Lyles as the keynote. The entire program is up for your review and registration. The topics range across automation, AI, machine learning, DevOps, performance testing, leadership, mobile testing, security, and so much more. And if you plan to attend the upcoming conference, do not forget there are various discounts and offers for alumni attendees and team registrations. If you have queries, do email them at info@softwaretestpro.com. And just before we go ahead, there is another piece of information I have for you. There is an upcoming webinar, 5 Secrets for Simplifying Your Automated Test Cases, on the 26th of June. The speaker is Paul Merrill, and who's the principal estate for Beaufort Fairmont LLC. He will discuss ways to simplify your automated test cases. The link is up for you to register. Please go for it. And if you are on Twitter, please share the conference information and about this webinar with your followers and connections. You can also add STP's Twitter handle to your tweets, which is @SoftwareTestPro. You can also note down the speaker's Twitter handle, which is USI_Lee Barnes. All right, so let's get started with the webinar today. A very warm welcome, Lee. We are very excited to have you with us today. And let me quickly introduce you for all of us here. So Lee is the founder and CTO of Utopia Solutions. He has over 25 years of experience in the software quality assurance and testing field. He has successfully implemented test automation and performance testing solutions in hundreds of environments across a wide array of industries. He's a recognized thought leader in his field and speaks regularly on related topics. As founder and CTO of Utopia Solutions, Lee is responsible for the firm's delivery of software quality solutions, which include process improvement, test automation, and performance management. Okay, testing people, let's get started with the discussion on the importance of effective test automation and the keys to make the test automation effective in DevOps. So very warm welcome again, Lee, and the floor is all yours now.
Thanks, Smita. Thanks so much. And thanks for everyone for joining today. I'm going to be talking about techniques for effective test automation in DevOps. And personally for me, and maybe for a lot of us today on the webinar, I come from a background where test automation meant automating huge regression test suites that were executed at the end of long development cycles. And unfortunately, if you go out in the world today, you're still going to find a lot of information that was born out of that mindset. And I think a lot of that probably came from commercial tool vendors' marketing messages going back 25 years. But what's relevant today is there's a lot of problems with that approach. And that legacy approach to automation will absolutely be counterproductive to what we're trying to do with DevOps. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how we can approach automation in a way that's much better aligned with what we're trying to accomplish with the DevOps approach. So just briefly, since Smita did such a great job on the introduction, CTO of Utopia Solutions, we're a QA testing focused service provider. Most of my background has spent focused on test automation, and certainly my thoughts and approach to automation have evolved quite a bit over that time. But I think one thing that's remained common is being passionate about helping folks do automation the right way. So not just a one-size-fits-all solution, not just a tool first approach, but what does it mean to bring automation principles to your testing practices? All right, a quick agenda before we get started. I'm going to start with just an intro, a level set to testing and test automation in DevOps. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some anti-patterns that we can fall into with respect to automation, especially with respect to DevOps. And then spend most of the time talking about what I call the 3 pillars of effective test automation, and that's scope, approach, and then test environment and data management. And we'll have a quick wrap up, and then I can address any questions that come up during the webinar at that time. All right, so we could probably debate the goal of DevOps and what DevOps is for the entirety of this webinar, but just suffice to say for this talk, the goal behind DevOps is to reduce dev cycles, more frequently release high quality software to your customers. So for testing, that means that it's moving from being part of the development cycle to be something that is throughout the development cycle. But so if that happens, if DevOps is going to achieve its potential, the feedback that we get from that testing needs to be fast, accurate, and actionable. Right? We can't be waiting for long, slow tests to run and then sift through piles of results to understand if that build is ready to be promoted. We certainly can't be wasting our time chasing down false positives or false negatives. I have a longer version of this talk where I go into a lot deeper discussion of specifically testing in DevOps. And while this format doesn't allow the time, I do want to bring up one important point about quality and testing in DevOps. And that's one common symptom that I see as organizations move to a DevOps approach where quality is supposedly everyone's responsibility. The problem I see is that sometimes when something's everyone's responsibility, it often becomes no one's responsibility. So before we start down the road of test automation, I think it's really important to embrace that culture that quality and testing is becoming everyone's responsibility, and the idea that it is responsibility of a team, a separate team or separate individuals is really counterproductive to what we're trying to accomplish in DevOps. Okay, so let's spend a little time talking about the importance of test automation in DevOps. I think in the past, organizations have looked at automation in sometimes as a nice to have or a Band-Aid to address some problems that they might have. But what you'll find as you learn more about DevOps is that it's absolutely necessary. And I think a good way to understand that is to look at this description of required continuous integration capabilities from the DevOps handbook. And I've highlighted the important parts with respect to automation. And the first point says we have to have a comprehensive and reliable set of automated tests. And the next point kind of drives that home by saying, hey, if we really are buying into the DevOps culture and we're going to stop the entire pipeline when those automated tests fail, they need to be reliable. So if we're going to pull that emergency brake when our automated tests fail, they are absolutely key to what we're trying to accomplish. I think another way to look at that, the importance, is to look at the level of automation across different categories of DevOps performers. This specific data is from DORA's 2018 State of DevOps report, and that shows the level of manual work across different categories of DevOps activities. Specific to testing, you can see high and elite performers have quite a bit more test automation, as well as the other activities, and that's important to note, compared to their lower performing counterparts. So that's great. Automation is absolutely required for effective DevOps. So what's the big deal, right? If all I need to do is automate my existing test, how hard can that be, right? I download one of the popular tools and I start automating. And a lot of times I hear, well, after all, it's only testing. I'm just going to automate it. But before we go any further, and I think if you're attending this webinar, you probably don't buy into that mindset, but I think it's important to address. I think we should look at some statistics that are pretty alarming if we consider all the time, money, effort that we collectively pour into test automation. So the first one from the World Quality Report says that the level of test automation in general is below 20%. And the context of that statement is that of all the potential testing activities that could be automated, less than 20% actually are. And while that's pretty disappointing, considering the vast amount of resources that we put into this, it also points, I think, to a huge opportunity to improve. Second, the report also shows that while that level of automation has been on an upward trend, the value that we realize from those automation efforts has been pretty much flat. So as we pour more and more resources in automation, we're not getting more value out of it, and that, of course, is an issue, especially if we're requiring automation to be successful in DevOps. And finally, this is a pretty well accepted statistic, although I always have trouble finding the original source, and that's about 80% of test automation implementations fail. So, and even if we don't agree on the exact number, I think we can agree that there's a huge opportunity for improvement, and that test automation obviously isn't just a point and click solution to your testing problem. So it is a big deal, and we do really need to understand how to be effective at it. So before we get into talking some of the common obstacles, one more point I want to make about automation, and that's to explore the misconception about what test automation really is. So if we can look at the definition of software testing, and you may have a better one, but this will suffice for this point, we can see terms like knowledge and experience and critical thinking and designing experiments. And when we're automating, when we say test automation, this is not what we're automating, right? Of course not. It's clearly that's not what's being automated. And I think so it's important to realize that test automation is not replacing the software testing, right? And if you spend any time in the software testing space, you'll see there's a movement to get away from saying test automation and replace it with automation in testing. I think that makes it much more clear that what we're doing here is applying automation principles to testing activities. And maybe it seems like semantics, but I think it will help get rid of this common misconception, at least give people pause to question why you said it that way as opposed to the more common test automation. So very clearly, we're not automating the testing. So as we talk about test automation for the remainder of this webinar, I don't want you to think of that as your testing. Just simply think of it as making certain activities that you perform as part of testing more efficient or more effective. Okay, so let's move on and talk about some common obstacles. Right? If we can agree that DevOps can't be successful without effective test automation, I really think we need to be aware of these common obstacles or traps to effective test automation. So the first one is either too much or in some cases not enough automation. I see a lot of instances where there are a ton of automated tests that were created just because they could be automated. So essentially automation just for the sake of automation. And really that's not enough justification, right? We've probably all been in situations or at least seen situations where someone's very proud to say how many tests they run every build every day, in the hundreds and thousands sometimes. But this is not a quantity over quality situation, right? We need those tests, especially in a DevOps pipeline, to be adding value. And somewhat less frequently, but certainly not unheard of, is not having enough automation. Maybe you just have very little coverage or not enough critical mass that you can even make an impact on your efficiency. Second, automating the wrong tests. And these are tests that aren't providing you value, aren't assessing risk as you move your build through the pipeline, or maybe tests that just can't be reliably automated for one reason or another. And that's just a complete waste of time and effort. So we'll be spending some time talking about how we can identify what the valuable tests are, what the right tests are for your test suites. And this is a huge one, focusing only on UI tests. And I think, again, a lot of us got our start in automation, and we're comfortable with doing it at the UI level, right? That's kind of where this whole process got started. But even when done correctly, these tests are the slowest, most unreliable type of automation that there is. I'm not saying we shouldn't have automation at the UI level, but I'm saying if 100% of your automation is at that level, especially if there are API service layers involved, that's probably going to be a problem at some point. This is also one of the top offenders, and that's not having a stable test environment or data to execute your test suites on. And we're going to talk a lot about this later on in the talk. And finally, not treating automation as code. Most of the automation work we do is code in one way or another. I'm not going to get into this deeply, but suffice to say that if we're going to rely on these automated tests, at least in part, to assess the quality of our product, we need to treat the code that those tests are built on with the same care that we give the app that we're testing. And I rarely see that. And again, I've been guilty of this in the past, and I think a lot of that is born out of a legacy approach where it was very tool focused versus process and approach focused. So we've talked about the obstacles to automation success. Let's see what effective automation looks like. And I found that the three main pillars or attributes of effective automation are scope, approach, or the method used to implement that automation, and environment and data. I'm going to talk about scope and approach together. I think they go hand in hand over the next few slides. But before we get into a detailed conversation about what the right test suites and right tests are, let's look at some of the trade-offs we encounter in a DevOps pipeline. As we go further down the pipeline, hopefully anyway, we have an increased confidence in a build's readiness for deployment. And typically those environments become more production-like. The trade-off is as those test environments become more complex, the time that it takes for those tests, again, at least typically, to give us the feedback increases. So we have this constant battle between risk assessment and coverage and the desire to get fast feedback and move through the pipeline quickly. And as we'll see, this really highlights the need to think very critically about the types of test suites first we create, and then which specific tests we put in them, and of course, how those tests are created. So first, let's talk about how we can assess the types of test suites that we need in our pipeline. I found that a good way to do that is to use a process introduced by Katrina Clokey and further refined by Ashley Hunsberger, and that's the test suite canvas. So the version I'm showing here is something that Ashley presented a couple years ago. And the idea behind the test suite canvas is to think about the important aspects of the test suite. So A, we can determine if we need it in the first place, and B, figure out what it's going to do and how we're going to implement it, and all of the things involved with not just implementation, but even ongoing ownership. It's very common, I think, in my experience, to start automating and creating test suites without thinking about the big picture. You know, what am I possibly going to encounter as I do this in terms of obstacles and what's going to happen after it's implemented and the application is changing, environments are changing. How is my test suite going to react to that? It's very common to not think about those things until they become a problem. So this whole process can help you prevent that. Then I think there should be a group exercise as well. So not just an automation engineer working in a vacuum, but the entire team, right? It's not 2 weeks of planning. It's a handful of hours where the team gets together and talks about the test suites that they think they need as part of their pipeline. You know, it's very easy for sometimes just to say we're going to have an API integration test or an end-to-end test, and not really think about the details that will go into all that, how it fits into our pipeline, and ultimately who's responsible for it. So this is I think anyway, a very important step in the process. So let's quickly go through the test suite canvas. So first, it has to have a purpose, right? Why are we going to build it in the first place? And that typically is aligned with the risks that we're trying to mitigate with it. What are the dependencies? So if I'm going to build this test suite, what systems or tools and other things need to be in place for this test suite to run successfully? Similarly, what constraints exist now that can prevent us from implementing this test suite successfully? Pipeline and execution. Where are we going to execute this test suite with respect to our pipeline? When will it be triggered? How often will it run? And similarly to execution, where are we going to execute? What environments? And how are we going to manage data in that environment? We'll talk a lot about that in a bit. Who's going to own it? And not just from a figurehead perspective, but if the test suite turns the build red, who's going to respond to that? Maintainability. And we talk about maintenance a lot with test automation, but not just from the maintaining the test suite perspective, but what needs to be in place if, for instance, we have to hand this test suite, the ownership of this test suite off to someone else. And finally, effectiveness. And this is really a metrics conversation. How are we going to continually assess that this test suite is giving us the value that we need from it? So I will say also this process does a good job of avoiding a common test automation anti-pattern, and that's creating this catch-all test suite that is typically targeted for a downstream environment and ends up serving as a substitute for all the testing and automation you should have been doing upstream. So once we've gone through that process for each of the test suites we think we might need, we'll take each canvas and transform them into a single spreadsheet, typically one row per test suite, so we can more easily see the universe of testing that we've mapped out for our pipeline. Can also help you identify any common constraints, dependencies that you have across multiple test suites, maybe allowing you to kill multiple birds with one stone. And once you have an idea of what test suites you need, I think it's a good exercise to map those out across your pipeline so you can start to visualize the flow of the build with respect to your risk assessments. And this also helps you understand if certain test suites must be run in series or they can be executed in parallel, for instance. All right, so once you have a good idea of what test suites are important, I think it's a good idea to start looking at how we can evaluate if tests are worthy of being part of that test suite. If your automated tests are going to be part of a DevOps, a continuous testing, continuous integration environment, they likely need to be ready to run anytime on demand. And as we already discussed, they need to provide fast, accurate, and meaningful feedback. And I think a good way to approach this is something that Bas Dijkstra, he's an automation engineer out of the Netherlands, came up with. He's a great acronym for reminding us about the qualities to look for when determining if your tests are fit for a DevOps pipeline. And that's FITR. It stands for focused, informative, trustworthy, and repeatable. First, focus, and this really refers to testing functionality as close as you possibly can to where it's implemented. For example, let's say we have a test with a tax calculation API. All right, and let's say I designed a test, probably a bad test, but I designed a test that tries to validate that by looking at the total field on an invoice screen. Now, if that test passes, I'm probably okay. Certainly, there could be some things that lined up and compensated for a tax error, but I'm likely okay. But if it doesn't match, if that test fails, now I've got a problem because I really don't know what caused that verification to fail. It could be the data for the items, the pricing data for the items on my invoice. It could be many, many, many other things. And yes, one of those things could be that there's an issue in my tax calculation. But if I had executed that test at the API layer, I would have a much more focused test and a much better idea of what went wrong. Next is informative. And I think if tests are focused, that will help them to be much more informative. But I think we can also do more. For the test itself, it should be as self-documented as possible. Again, in a vast majority of the cases, these tests are implemented in code of some sort. So someone looking at that code should understand its intent, not have to wait until looking at a report or some type of test results to understand what was going on. And similarly, that output, the logging and reporting, should provide us some detailed feedback as to what happened, especially if an issue is encountered. A lot of times, if I'm looking at test reports, and a very common issue is I couldn't find a UI element on the screen, and a very high percentage of the time I'll see a stack trace, and yes, you can get the information, most of it anyway, that you need from that stack trace, but there's a lot of white noise there as well. What I really want to understand is what field I was looking for, what locator I was using to try to find it, and probably a screenshot. And 99% of the time, that's enough information to help me understand what went wrong. Next is trustworthy, and I think this is a real big one, especially in a DevOps environment. If we're going to be part of the build pipeline, and especially if part of your culture is to stop the process if an issue is encountered, the tests have to be trusted. And if they can't be trusted, you're going to lose the privilege of being part of that pipeline, or you're just going to be ignored. And either situation is really not what we're trying to achieve here. And finally is repeatable. So if we're going to kick off these tests automatically by some event that we're not controlling, they need to be ready to go. And this usually means that we've taken care of business with respect to test environment and data management. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Actually, next. So we're going to spend the remainder of time talking about environment and data. And I think one of the most common phrases we hear when trying to understand and reproduce an issue is, well, it worked on my machine. And as we just discussed, test automation scope and approach are certainly obstacles to effective automation, but as this year's World Quality Report states, test environment and data are the top challenges. And this, I think, has been true for quite a while. We can do a great job of figuring out what test suites we need and which tests should be in those test suites, and then build very efficient, effective frameworks to execute them. But if we don't have stable test environments and data, it's not going to matter. And the root cause of, well, it worked on my machine is often related to some environment or data issues. So over the next few minutes, we're going to discuss what we can do to remove, hopefully anyway, that phrase from our testing vernacular. So I think a good way to start doing that is to look at the spectrum of test environment and data situations. At one end, we have the good old static shared environments that are created and seem to persist forever. And I see a lot of people, even with DevOps, trying to implement that approach that are still working with shared and static test environments. And I've added stale to that because by their very nature, the data in these environments often becomes stale over time. So this type of environment, it often causes a cascading set of issues, right? Because they're shared, that causes instability in the data. Maybe someone changes data that is needed by someone else. And depending on the approach to managing that data, and there often isn't one, the data is probably stale. We also have scheduling conflicts. Maybe UAT is trying to do their work, but someone also needs to run a load test, and maybe training department wants to use it because their environment is even in worse shape. And it's probably not very production-like either. Very often not in size or shape, but even to the degree where no one is ever quite sure of the configuration. And those issues are the root cause of many of the automation challenges that we've referred to so far. The data instability results in unreliable execution. Because we can't rely on the data, maybe we're forced to set up all our data each time that we want to execute, and that doesn't sound like a very fast feedback type situation to me. Data or configuration issues can result in false positives or worse, false negatives, and all of that results in a ridiculously long time for analysis because we're really not ever sure if issues are actually issues, and if they are, what caused them. So we spend a lot of time trying to figure that out. So let's take a look at the other end of the environment data spectrum, where we have dynamic, dedicated, fresh environments. They're dynamic, so we can create them on demand using virtualization and infrastructure as code technologies. Because they're easier to create and manage, we can likely have more of them and dedicate them to a specific function and eliminate all the issues associated with sharing environments. For the same reasons, we can make them production-like if we want, or at least be in a state where everyone is working in separate but identical environments, and that goes a long way to removing the "it worked on my machine" problem. And since we're creating the environments on demand, perhaps, we might as well ensure that it has the data we need in the state that we need it. So let's move on to test data. And I'm sure we can all relate stories of testing issues that we've encountered that were somehow related back to data. Again, if we look back at the World Quality Report, the biggest data-related challenges were keeping data in sync with tests. And this is a situation where the tests are inputting data that is no longer appropriate, given whatever the current state of the system under test is, or maybe the test is expecting a data response that is different from what the system is giving. And not because there's anything wrong with the system, just because the state of the data changed. Next is the lack of test data for complex integration testing. And these are tests typically that are further down the pipeline, maybe something like a long end-to-end flow. And finally, and I think very similar to the second point, is maintaining consistent data across systems under test. And to me, this speaks more to data in external services or other systems that make up, again, an end-to-end business flow. But independent of the specific challenge, it all results in the inability to reliably execute automated tests on demand. And that really flies in the face of what DevOps needs from test automation. So all of this is starting to point to a need for a strategy to manage that test data. And if you remember back to the test suite canvas, one of the sections talked about data. So it's important to start having these conversations before we start building frameworks and start automating tests. And it's certainly something that has to be done before we need to execute them. So as we think about our test suites and subsequently the tests that we're going to add to them, we really need to pay attention to the data that each of our potential tests needs if we're going to somehow develop a strategy to manage it. But it's very easy to just begin automating tests and creating tests and almost subconsciously include that data. But we really, even if we didn't think about them when we created the test, we have to go back and understand what I call the dimensions of that data. And these are just essentially the attributes of the data that describe how it lives and behaves in the system under test. So these are some key input questions you need to ask yourself to begin to gather the information you need to develop a test data management strategy. First is the type of data, and in most cases this means if it's structured, for example, in a relational database, or maybe unstructured with no fixed format or length or organizational pattern. And of course, the value of the data is important. Either a specific value or maybe a class of values, specific account type, for instance. Time is very important. A lot of times, I'm sure we've all had this, we have tests that have passed for a period of time and they suddenly start failing. And often time turns out to be the culprit there. Maybe the data expired. For example, an insurance policy reached its expiration date. Another example is credentials, right? We have corporate security policy that requires us to cycle passwords every so often. And if that data is part of your test cases, they're going to fail for no other reason than the data has expired. The ability for data to be reused or not is very important as well. For example, if I'm testing an e-commerce system, the account I'm using to purchase items can likely be reused in multiple executions. However, if I'm testing shipping an order, I can only ship a specific order once, and I need to understand that dimension. Volume is another important aspect. And this almost always comes into play for something like load testing or multi-user testing, right? Maybe we need a number of user accounts to spread across our concurrent users. But I think there's also some subtleties here as well. Sometimes you need a specific data value to represent some volume. So think about a level of inventory for a SKU or some level of available credit for account. And over time, those levels get depleted, and eventually that data can no longer support a test objective. Finally is, where does the data live, right? If we're going to possibly develop a strategy to manage it, we really need to understand where it's coming from so we can evaluate our options for controlling it. So let's talk a little bit about how we can develop a test data management strategy. And unfortunately, at least that I found, there's no step-by-step recipe or one-size-fits-all solution for this. It's going to vary quite a bit from organization to organization, based on where that data lives, what the dimensions are, what the state of your environments are, et cetera. Even what works for one organization with a specific e-commerce platform is likely not going to work for a different organization implementing the exact same platform. There's just too many variations to take into consideration. So I think it's better to talk about potential techniques so we can expand our tool belt of potential solutions as we dig into our own situations. So let's talk about some of those potential tools. First, there are some things that we can do at the application level. We've got the tried and true data refresh, right? It's essentially replacing the current data in your environment with data from a known state. It's a fairly common approach, but the way it's typically done doesn't work very well in DevOps. It's often a slow, long process. And oftentimes that refresh is done at a cadence that's just way too slow for DevOps. Remember, we want to be able to execute on demand. And also, this is likely not going to work well for integrated systems that can't be refreshed at the same time or in the same way. We also have something I call data partitioning, and this is where we can dedicate certain data objects for use only by certain automated test suites, maybe certain accounts. If we've got a warehouse management system, maybe we dedicate a warehouse to specific test suite, and that's only used for that purpose. And this can help with the issues related to shared test environments if you have them, assuming that, of course, no other activity touches that data, because it's really kind of an on your honor type situation. We can also, especially in the DevOps world, we can also dedicate entire environments to test automation. And of course, that depends on a lot of factors like complexity and cost. Now, these can all be effective, but they may not be flexible and nimble enough for DevOps, at least alone. So let's look at some things that we can do at the test suite level that lend themselves better to a DevOps environment. First, we can have the tests create the data they need prior to execution. And this is maybe often combined with data partitioning to further lessen the chance of data-related issues. For example, a test may create some inventory, but the SKU and the inventory location are designated for automation only. Similarly, we can have the tests clean up after themselves, put the data back in the state that it found it. And similar to having dedicated automation environments, but with the added twist that we're creating test environments in the state we need it, we can create them on demand and perhaps blow the environments away when we're done. Finally, we can build some capabilities into our frameworks that handle data, and this is especially effective for data that changes over time or follows some rules that make it impossible to use the same data for each execution. For example, we often will, if we know what data is changing over time, rather than embed the actual values into our tests, we'll use static placeholders. And then we'll map those placeholders centrally to the actual values, and we'll map we'll change those values in that central location once, and then the framework replaces those static tags at runtime. So it reduces the maintenance a little bit in terms of that we have as data changes over time. Of course, we have full-blown test management solutions that were purpose-built for managing data in test environments. And I like to throw in service virtualization here as well, because it can address situations where you need to test your code against dependencies that maybe aren't ready yet. Also can come in very handy for addressing data issues in dependent systems or components that are just outside your control. I think the important takeaway here, though, is to understand that A, test data management is absolutely important, required to test automation, and that B, we need to have a decent tool belt of techniques that we can use to address whatever our specific situation is. All right, before we open it up for questions, let's talk briefly about some key takeaways. And I think if anything else, these are the important points I'd like you to take home. And first is that, again, effective test automation is required to achieve success in DevOps, but test automation is not automating the testing, right? So we need to think about these techniques to make it effective so we can achieve our DevOps objectives. Part of that is creating the right test suites. So we talked about the test suite canvas as a potential technique there, that of course contain the right tests, right? We want reliable tests that are adding value. Anything else is just extending that feedback loop unnecessarily. As we just talked about, ensure you understand your test environment and data requirements, and most importantly, you have a strategy to manage them. And we didn't talk about this, but it's important to continuously improve. And I think that's a big part of the DevOps culture, and is equally important within the practice of test automation. It's not a fire and forget solution. Once we have a test suite in place or a specific set of test cases in place, often the tendency is just let them roll. But you're going to find better ways to do things, better approaches. You're going to find tests that are unreliable, tests that are no longer adding value. And you need to address those as you go through in the same way that you're addressing improving the application that you're trying to test in the first place. And finally, and maybe to your surprise, we didn't really talk about specific tools. And I think that's, from my perspective anyway, that's because tools are enablers of your test automation approach. They are not the solution, right? And so many people approach test automation from a tool-first perspective, right? That's the first decision they make. What tool, what framework am I going to use? But in my experience, it's really step 4 or 5, right? It's all these fundamental things that you need to get in place first, and then find the best tool, the best technology to enable what you're trying to accomplish. So with that, we'll open it up to questions. If there's any questions that come up after the fact, you can always feel free to contact me any of these ways. I love talking about this stuff, and so please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lee. That was pretty insightful. And yes, we do have certain questions, so we're going to get started with those quickly. Let me take the first question for you. Okay, so it says, Lee, have you experienced organizations where the QA test environment is more advanced than the development environment? Since we are talking about test automation in DevOps, what I find is that the environment which we run automation on can be no better than the environment which DevOps sets up for the development team.
I think that's a relatively common situation for a handful of reasons. So yes, I've seen that. I think because historically QA and test they've been the final step in the process. They need to understand and address the issues that environments and data can cause. So they're much more in tune to those potential issues, and then take care of business a little bit better with respect to data and environment control and management. Whereas maybe upstream, because there's historically been less testing being done, and I'm generalizing a bit, but because there's historically been less testing being done, they pay less attention to that. But absolutely, if you're going to, and not everyone needs to get here, but if you're going to someday get to the point where you're automatically deploying, so a build is moving through a pipeline through some environments without being touched, those environments need to be controlled and managed. And yes, the more from a configuration perspective anyway, the more identical they can be, the better the better likelihood that you're going to be able to get those tests to run successfully without being impacted by any environment or data issues. Good question.
Yeah, thanks, Lee, on that. Here is your under question. So it says, thanks, this is a great presentation. How do you think test suites and test data are organized, or maybe how they should be organized? Because the question is, should they be tightly coupled?
Well, I think they absolutely should be. So each test suite, and that's we didn't go into detail, but as you think about the test suite canvases and what test suites are important, and then you start developing your tests. Yes, coupling the data required for each test suite, even having it under configuration control, I've seen be a very effective approach. You don't have to have the same data in every environment as you go through the pipeline because you're likely running different tests. It's more a situation where you need to understand in each environment what that data is and manage it. I've seen organizations that have made their environments throughout the pipeline consistent in terms of what data is there. And they're running different types of tests, but essentially against the same data, and they've made those environments and data large enough or large enough scope anyway to be effective for all their testing. But typically, I see the data coupled with specific test suites. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wish we could discuss a lot more on this topic,
yes.
but we'll keep it to that. Yes, it could be. Another question here is, would you run different automated test sets in QA versus the pre-prod environment, or would you recommend running the automated test suites in all environments?
I think what the question is getting at is would I run the same set of automated tests in all environments? So typically what I see from a risk assessment perspective is there's a goal of test as it moves through environments. So no, there's typically not from a testing objective perspective, I'm not running the same tests in each environment. However, I see that happening not for the purposes of let's say I've got a pre-prod environment, as you say, and I've got a set of end-to-end tests that are running there. I may, if I've done a good job of controlling my environments and data, I may run that same test suite in upstream environments, again, not for the purposes so much of testing the builds, but for identifying impact that I may have missed on my test suite. Now, obviously, if you're running the same test suite across multiple environments, you either need to somehow manage the data that each test suite is using in each environment, or you've got to make them very consistent. But again, typically I see different test suites for different purposes and in different environments. If I do see, running test suites, it's typically more of the downstream test suites that are being executed upstream for more of the purpose of identifying impact to the test suite itself, and also used as a smoke test perhaps. But that's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think maybe the smoke tests could be common, but the actual test sets would also depend on, firstly, definite, as you said, data sets, and also maybe what release it is. Like there could be different set of codes actually being released on different environment and different sprints and different sprints moving on. So maybe it will also depend upon the scope.
Yeah, very, very good point. It really depends on how your pipeline is set up and what builds are in which environments. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So moving on to the next question. How closer you feel automation to dev in upcoming years? I believe what they're trying to ask is how much do you think automation is like development, or how close it's going to be like development in upcoming years?
I think, well, I think it's already pretty close to development. I think there will always be kind of this battle between maybe tool vendors that want to make automation less like development and expand it to quote unquote non-developers, and then the techniques that having developers even code their own automation because of their knowledge of the application and the testability of the application. So I don't know. I don't know that it's going to change all that much. I think there's going to be kind of this pull from both directions where there's some efficiencies for having it more like software development, where you're automating right next to the developer and right next to the code that you're testing. And then from the other direction, you've got tool vendors that are trying to make it more available to non-developers, and we're going to have this kind of healthy battle back and forth, and the answer is probably going to be somewhere in the middle.
True. I do agree with you, actually. A lot of automation is already a lot of development. Okay, moving on to our next question here. In terms of continuous testing, would it be time consuming to develop automated test scripts? With the current situation, can we think of generating test scripts automatically without someone putting efforts in building test suites?
So I think the question is getting to is there deficiencies there by somehow creating automated test suites using some Oracle or some heuristic that that might be helpful. I think anything, right? So if we think about test automation generally, and not just kind of the classic, I'm automating the execution of test steps. I think that is test automation, right? If it makes sense for you to generate test cases, maybe you've got some rules engine or some other type of Oracle you can use to generate effective tests and valuable tests. I think that's important. Then yes, let's use that. Can that be done in all situations? No, but in the general sense, that is test automation. We're using automation principles to make a testing activity. In this case, generating test cases or permutations of test cases for us, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. But I don't think that works in every situation. I don't think we're going to have a tool that magically we can, any of us can purchase or download that will automatically generate the test cases we need. Even if we have the right data to give it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely with you on this. Yes. I think if, like you mentioned the right words, if there's an oracle of it and you have a good mapping to which part of code is being covered by which part of test scripts, and so we can definitely kind of do some kind of mapping automatically, but I don't think it can be generated completely by itself.
Agreed.
All right. So your next question is, what strategies do you usually apply to enable teams delivering in the spirit of shared ownership of quality or testing between DevOps, that is between devs, test, and ops? So what strategies do you usually apply to enable teams delivering in the spirit of shared ownership of quality between devs, test, and ops?
Yeah, I think that's an important part of software development culture, and especially DevOps culture, is that shared ownership. And one simple example is the test suite canvas, and having that be a team exercise. If you look at it, you'll see that there's pieces of it that talk about the approach to automation, that talk about testability, that talk about the environments and the data, and that's development, that's testing, that's DevOps. And to have everyone sit down and understand how we're going to mitigate risk in our pipeline by developing these test suites, and then understanding what has to happen from a development, from an ops, from a test approach to make that happen. That's a huge first step, I think, in the right direction. I think also the culture of assuming you have focused, reliable, trustworthy tests, having the entire organization stop and start to look into the issues as they're identified before they go on is an important piece of that as well, right? We identified an issue, we have a good idea if it's a focused, trustworthy test. We've got some good information to go on. The whole organization jumps in, figures out what the issue is. Maybe it was a data issue we missed. Maybe it was a test issue. Maybe it was an application issue or an environment issue. But the organization as a whole is sharing that responsibility, addressing the issue, learning from it, improving, and then moving on. So I think a good first step in getting the organization involved and moving that way is something like the Test Suite Canvas. It forces the entire organization to think about quality and not just the test team or just the tester or just the automation engineer. Very good question.
Yeah, thank you. Here is your next question. Pretty similar on the same lines. When there is a dedicated DevOps team, do QA teams still need to get involved or get themselves involved in DevOps?
Well, we could talk all day about this, I think. The question the underlying question is, are QA teams going away because of DevOps? Or are they no longer valuable because of DevOps? I absolutely don't think so. It seems every organization organizes themselves differently. They may say that they're agile or they're taking a DevOps approach, but there's no two that are organized similarly. I often see a virtual QA team, right? So where it may be in an old waterfall approach, it was a siloed, dedicated center of excellence or whatever it was called, and the code came over the wall and they executed their regression test or whatever they were responsible for and then threw the results back. That's not happening anymore, but someone responsible for the quality standards, for the approaches, for understanding what tools are appropriate, et cetera, that organization may exist virtually. I see the actual people embedded and distributed to the teams typically. And again, with in today's global workforce, it doesn't necessarily mean they're sitting in the same room together, but absolutely, there is still a place for QA focused, testing focused individuals. But I think the days of putting them in a silo and expecting them to be effective, I think those days are over.
There's so many questions coming up, Lee, but I'm going to take one more question. And any question that remains unanswered, we are going to send them to you. Please feel free to send them back to us and we'll post them on the blog and share them with the attendees.
Will do. Okay? Thank you.
Yes. So here is your last question that I'm going to take. That is, do you include unit testing as part of QA testing along with Selenium style UI testing, or would that be down a dev testing pipeline?
Well, I think unit testing always is going to be more efficiently done by the developer if that's what they're asking. From a QA perspective, I'll often see someone with responsibility for coming up with the standards and the approach to unit testing. But I don't think I've ever seen unit testing not being done by the developers, if that was the question.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, agree with you. Maybe we'll just take this one last one because this is the one remaining. So here it is. Guess the traditional test pyramid needs to be updated with DevOps tests for infrastructure and deployment related checks, as unit tests are included from dev perspective at the base of the pyramid. So they're asking that if the traditional test pyramid needs to be updated with the DevOps for infrastructure and deployment related checks.
Well, So I think the traditional test pyramid, I think there's a lot of different versions and evolutions of it that try to take into account more a full scale approach to the types of testing that's done. So absolutely, infrastructure testing and testing your pipeline itself should be part of that. I think even the telemetry, the monitoring telemetry that comes from the application should be represented in some type of model like that. I'm not a fan of the pyramid in that I don't think I've ever seen that exact scale of here's my unit test versus my integration test versus my UI or end-to-end test. But I think what is very good at is get people thinking about, hey, there are different types of testing. They shouldn't all be in the same ratio. Certain tests are easier, faster, more reliable to implement. Certain tests are slower, less reliable to implement, more expensive to maintain. So as long as we're thinking about those things, and again, making sure we're getting high value tests and we're in their focus, we're testing at the right level, I think that's the important lesson to be learned from something like a test automation pyramid. There's a good representation, kind of an evolution of the test automation pyramid in Katrina Clokey's Testing in DevOps book. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I think she does a real good job of trying to think about it more from a DevOps perspective. So, but very good question.
So it was a very insightful session on effective test automation in DevOps. So thank you so much, Lee. And I'm sure our attendees found it very informative and useful too. So thanks again, Lee, and I hope to see you at STPCon soon.
Yep, I'll be there. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, everyone, this concludes our webinar for today. Thanks for joining in, and more importantly, thank you for asking so many questions and being engaging and making the most of the webinar for yourself and the whole group. If you want to see more such sessions from speakers like Lee Barnes and wish to learn more about testing, do join us at STPCon Fall 2019. The entire program has been selected and announced. Do take a few minutes to look them up at stpcon.com. If you have queries on registrations, do email them at info@softwaretestpro.com. Don't forget, we're celebrating our 10 years in testing there. And stay tuned for more webinars and online trainings coming soon at softwaretestpro.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the upcoming webinar, which is 5 Secrets for Simplifying Your Automated Test Cases on 26th of June, then please do it. The speaker is Paul Merrill, who is the principal estate of Beaufort Fairmont LLC. Like I said earlier, he will discuss ways to simplify your automated test cases, and so their maintenance is not a nightmare for you, and you also get to speed up your testing. If the topic interests you, please register for the same at softwaretestpro.com. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week ahead. See you all in Boston in September, and keep practicing your testing and test automation.